Hi, this is The Philosophical Angle, and I am your host, Chris Angle. I am the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is The Philosophical Equations of Economics. Along with me is my discussant and panelist is Rick Samuelson. Rick graduated from Yale, has an MA from Tufts, an MBA from Wharton. He's retired from the investment banking industry and is now a venture capitalist. Good to see you, Rick.
Thank you.
The purpose of the philosophical angle is to examine the nature of the concepts being used in current media and compare the essence of the concept with the usage and circumstances in which the term is being used. This week, the subject of discussion will be an article from the Wall Street Journal on August 18th, 2013, by Sara Schaefer Munoz, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, entitled U.S. Rice Farmers Cash In on Venezuelan Socialism. The subtitle of this is U.S. Exporters Benefit as Production Falls in Latin American Country. Well, I'm going to take some segments and read from this article, and then we'll discuss, we'll deliver our comments. The article starts by saying Mr. Chavez, I don't think I'm pronouncing that probably correctly either, became a moneymaker for the capitalist systems he deplored in his self-styled social revolution. During his 14 years in power, he nationalized large farms, redistributed land, controlled food prices as part of a strategy to help the poor. But these policies turned Venezuela from a net exporter to a net importer of rice. And it isn't just rice. Production of steel, sugar, and many other goods has fallen in Venezuela, leading to occasional shortages. Until recently, Venezuela was largely self-sufficient in beef and coffee. Now it imports both. In a paragraph following that, in this year's first half, the U.S. exported $94 million of rice to Venezuela, a 62% jump from a year earlier, making Venezuela the U.S. 4th largest rice market, according to the Department of Agriculture. Overall, Venezuela imports have quadrupled since Mr. Chavez took office to $59.3 billion in 2012 from about $14,500 billion in 2000, according to Venezuela government figures and economists at Barclays PLC. Exports to Venezuela from the U.S. hit $12 billion in 2011, up 16% from the previous year. Later on in the article, a recent World Bank report says that 30% of people who were originally considered not poor in Venezuela fell into poverty between 1992 and 2006. Venezuela's budget deficit reached 12% of GDP last year, higher than the troubled Eurozone economies like Greece or Spain. Its annual inflation rate rose to 42.6% in July. Mr. Maduro, like Mr. Chavez, blames food shortages on hoarding by private companies, waging economic war against his government. Later on in the article, it says oil accounts for about half the government's income. Later on, Venezuela's industrial output has faltered since 2006, when Venezuela said it would pursue an endogenous or self-sufficient development model that shuns profit-making and focuses instead on cooperatives. The government took control of wide swaths of major industries, including steel and cement. Production of bauxite, a key ingredient in making aluminum, fell 70% between 2007 and 2012. Well, it seems that the Venezuelan industry and commerce and economy is going down. It's imploding. So why is that happening? First, we see Venezuelan socialism. It's the key policy. It's the central policy of the government. Has been for the present leader and previously Mr. Chavez. It seems to have a key component of price controls, and this produces war against a profit. And there are two types of profit. There's individual profit and there's corporate profit. And government says that these private companies are waging economic war. So, in summary, the article says exports are down, number of poor is increasing, imports are increasing, and there are supply shortages. And all of it seems to be getting worse. Overall production has gone down, production of goods and services. So why? Why is this happening in the worker paradise of Venezuela? Well, there's probably a loss of profit. And with loss of profit becomes loss of incentive. Industries were nationalized. And what happens when industries are nationalized? They're controlled by governments. In this case, the Venezuelan government has come in and it applies its particular priorities to the companies. And their management then starts to make many of the management decisions. Well, what happens is that there is now less knowledge within the company to produce its service or product because there are fewer minds associated with the development of these goods and services. In other words, the government is coming in, controlling it. The government has less knowledge about the industry than the present management. And so less knowledge is being produced to manufacture these goods and services. In other words, the knowledge of many transactions and by the many are now consolidated. Because as every economic transaction, there is a degree of risk, there's a degree of knowledge and time and effort to be able to produce your good or service. So there's a loss of profit, and we know from the article and from the sources that it cites. And thus there's a lack of incentive. So when profit goes around and you want to make something and you are getting less reward for that, you have less incentive. So what is profit? And is it really good? Well, profit equals a sacrifice. You sacrifice your risk, your knowledge, your time, your effort, and your material, if it's a good, to produce something, to produce a reward. So you make a sacrifice to produce a reward, and you do that to get that reward because it brings you up away from misery, makes your life happy, makes your life good. So when you manufacture something, or you would go off to work. Let's say you go off to work and you get a paycheck, and that allows you on Sunday afternoon to sit out on the porch and read a book, That's individual profit. That gives you the leeway to enjoy your life. And that's what we strive for. That's what every individual strives for. So individual applying to his sacrificing of his energy, of his time and his effort equals an individual reward. And as we see, that allows us to be out on the porch on Sunday afternoon enjoying a nice day, which is good. We work to be able to receive good things for our life. But the corporation is no different. The corporation also makes a sacrifice. And the corporation also gets its reward. And that reward is no different from the individual reward going to work and receiving his paycheck. And from that reward is a profit. And the profit is goodness, just as the individual profit is goodness. Well, if you take away that profit from the individual or the corporation, you have less goodness. Less goodness to run your life, or less profit to run the corporation, to be able to invest in the future. And if you take away the profit of the individual or profit of the corporation, you take away the incentive to go out and get this reward. And this reward, which is, as we've said, it's goodness. So it's no wonder that when you take away the profit of the corporation, exports go down, loss of incentive, poor are increasing, imports are increasing, supply shortages. So let's go to Rick and see if he has any comment on why these things are happening in Venezuela. Rick?
Yes, well, we've certainly seen these socialist experiments before. The experience of China in the 50s with collectivization and price controls and so forth. Russia at an earlier stage. The results there were a catastrophe, leading to mass starvation in both cases. That doesn't seem to have reached that point yet in Venezuela, but the trend seems always to be the same. In the absence of sound capitalist principles by which to run your economy, which honor private ownership, the ability to set prices on one's own, the ability to set up businesses under one's control, and the rule of law, these socialist experiments will always yield the same unfortunate and frankly destructive results, where less is produced on a more costly basis. So it's a shame that politicians periodically seem to forget the lessons of even the recent past and venture into these dead ends over and over again. And sadly, I don't think it's going to end here. I think you'll see other countries continue to make the same mistakes before they ultimately right themselves, if they ever do, and get back on a sustainable footing.
I'm sorry, I missed, what was the example that you used where you were talking about Soviet Russia?
Yeah, the Soviets, of course, experimented with collectivization and price controls, and that was the period under Stalin when there was mass starvation going on because not enough food was being produced. The same happened to the Chinese at a somewhat later period. And, unfortunately, steps weren't taken to reverse these measures quickly enough to prevent literally millions of people from dying.
Yeah, some of the other great social experiments, Pol Pot of Cambodia, Mao in China. Now, Mao was an avid communist. So can we lump communism with socialism here? Are these forms of history's form of communism part of a subset of socialism?
I would see it as a continuum. At one extreme is communist philosophy, but socialism is certainly a lot closer to communism than it is to capitalism. So it's not surprising that you see some of the same quote-unquote unintended consequences.
Right. Can we say actually maybe socialism is a moderate form of communism?
Yes, I would think so, yes, in most cases.
Right. And so, are there any types of socialism out there that have done well? For example, well, what about Mussolini's Italy? Some people call that fascist, but I would say that isn't fascism the government's control of the means to manufacture goods and services, which is really an extreme form of socialism. And what about Germany? Actually, wasn't there kind of an economic miracle in Germany in the 30s? Yet that was done through the Nazi Party, but the Nazi Party were socialists. Did they have a different kind of socialism, perhaps? What do you think about that? They did have a pretty good miracle going in the 30s.
Yes, but they focused their management efforts, governmentally sponsored management efforts, on industry. There was no collectivization of farming, as far as I recall, in either the case of Italy or Germany. Obviously, as the war progressed, there was rationing because of scarcity, but leading up to that period, leading up to the war, it was a different approach with a focus on growing their manufacturing base under government sponsorship more than focusing on collectivizing the agricultural sector.
Okay, so
yeah.
So the difference between what the German socialistic policies of the 30s and Venezuelan policies now would be what? What do you suppose the difference is? Yet, because the German economy was expanding, and the Venezuelan economy is imploding.
Well, the Germany of the 30s, that's a really complicated period for them. Remember, there was hyperinflation, orders of magnitude higher than anything Venezuela is experiencing at the moment.
Right.
So there were severe shortages on account of that, because of the burden of the debt repayments brought about by the Treaty of Versailles. So conditions for Germany in the 30s were really severe, and for Germans themselves, personally, were very, very severe. There were wheelbarrows of money required to pay for a loaf of bread. The anecdotal evidence is dreadful. So the socialists under Hitler came into a situation that was already very severe and brought about in large part by the reparations crisis, which was a result of the Treaty of Versailles. That's not the be-all and end-all of that situation, but that was the most important factor causing, following also, of course, the destruction associated with World War I. But that burden, which the other European countries did not experience to anything like the same degree, is what brought about the conditions for emergency kinds of measures that the socialists put in force. So it's very difficult to compare Germany and Venezuela directly, given the circumstances leading up to the rise of the socialists in Germany.
Okay. What about other modern countries that we can call socialistic, including the United States, which I guess our socialism began in the 1930s also under President Roosevelt, and have really expanded over the last 50 years or so, 60, 70 years. But other countries throughout Europe and have increased their socialistic tendencies. France is a good example. Why is France in a better position than Venezuela? Is it just the degree of socialism that they've implanted, or is it something else?
Well, you don't see collectivized farming in France. I mean, it's still large. The taxes are very heavy, clearly, but the farming sector in France is very productive, and France is arguably the breadbasket for Western Europe. So France is a mixed economy. I think a place like Greece would be more comparable, where they're running chronically huge government deficits, like Venezuela. They run typically large trade deficits, like Venezuela. Again, not as extreme. There aren't the shortages you see in Venezuela. But I think Greece would be more comparable with the currency. Obviously, they're on the euro, but they're unable to service. There's already talk of reverting to the original Greek currency in order for the economy to adjust, and that's the crisis in confidence that the banks have regarding Greece. Further has compounded in the past their problems, and it's only the fact that the EU and under German leadership has been willing to periodically come to the rescue that's allowed Greece to remain as stable as it has, despite extremely high levels of unemployment and continually high levels of government deficits. But Venezuela doesn't have the EU behind them, so the subsequent impact is that much greater.
Okay, and they're really Venezuela is really running off the nationalized oil industry. They're, I guess, 50%, or as I recall from that article, a tremendous amount was being used. The revenue produced by the nationalized oil industry is what is driving the economy, or at least the government operations.
Well, I mean, the tragedy is that Venezuela should be extremely prosperous because they have that advantage that, frankly, most other South American countries do not. And so it should be, a standout in terms of economic growth and prosperity for its people. But it's just the opposite. So, it stands as a tragic irony.
So do you think possibly we can make a statement that there's a gradation throughout the world, socialism and fascism, so that the poorest countries are communistic or heavily socialistic, where property rights are non-existent or very little, such as and industries nationalized and owned by governments, and even right down to farms. Then maybe, which would be an example, I guess, would be Venezuela, and maybe Argentina. We can throw Argentina possibly in there. To the next level of maybe Greece, Then beyond that would be maybe France. Of course, they don't, as you say, they don't have private enterprise. They still have private enterprise throughout the country. It's just heavily taxed. And so, would you say that there's possibly a gradation between, or a correlation between socialistic policies and prosperity?
Well, absolutely. And if you want the ultimate in terms of extreme examples, try North Korea. I actually traveled to the border of North Korea some years ago, and the most striking thing about the border is, on one side, the southern side, I might add, there are trees. On the northern side, the mountains are all denuded. And the reason they're denuded, of course, is people cut down the trees for firewood. And that's why there's massive flooding in North Korea and very little in South Korea. And tremendous erosion as well. And so that, of course, has made the agricultural production fall over many years, and has been very poor because of that. So North Korea, I think, is arguably even more centralized, more controlled, less free, more communistic / socialistic / dictatorial place than Venezuela, and has been for years, and the result is telling. People are starving.
Right. Okay, Rick, I want to thank you for your comments and insight, and this was the Philosophical Angle. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.